1 Corinthians chapter 10. Question is, what is your idol? What is your idol this morning? Because we all have them. Idols are kind of like, idols are very subtle, put it that way. Idols try to be unknown, and we're self-deceived to some degree, so we kind of hide them ourselves. But when I was sitting there this morning in our living room looking out the window as the sun comes up, if you look west, you can see part of Windsor. You can probably see Natalie's house over in that direction. But when the sun is just the right angle, all the windows in those houses over there just look like lights. They just come on, right? And it's just for a short period of time. They're in a 15, 20-minute window when the sun's at just the right angle, just beating on those windows, and all of a sudden, poof, it looks like everything's lit up. And then it goes up and they're all gone. And the truth is, in our lives, that's the way idols are. They're rarely seen. We rarely see our own idols. We tend to overlook them if we are aware of them. But when the sun, through the Word of God, capital S-O-N, shines into our lives, He does reveal those idols to us, right? There's things in our life. And the truth is we are, I think as Calvin put it, an idol factory. We're constantly making idols in our lives. We're generating things. We have different idols than obviously people in other countries, third world countries, that are bowing down to some stick or piece of metal. But they're nonetheless just as serious. And Paul's going to get into that a little bit today. And the question is, what is your idol? Some of us had the idol of health, maybe. And we take, especially when you're younger, you take for granted your health. You assume your health. Then something happens, and all of a sudden, you feel like you've been ripped off, and someone's taken away something that you deserve. And the truth is, we don't deserve anything. I mean, God, everything that God gives us is just pure grace. You know, we've been praying for, and we've shared a little bit about our friend down in South Carolina, she's in Florida now, who had this ongoing bowel issue thing and surgeries and all kinds of stuff. It's been like a month now she's been in the hospital. And we could get real angry with God because God took away the thing that I count as mine. And it could happen at a young age. You never know. It could be your comfort. You know, we all like to be comfortable. We love our house that we have now. And we're comfortable, and the heat comes on in the morning, and we're comfortable when it's 19 degrees outside, and on it goes. The comfort level is there. And then all of a sudden something happens. Maybe one day you wake up and the electric isn't working, or one day you wake up and your refrigerator's quit, or something happens that takes away that comfort level, and all of a sudden you find out how much of an idol that really was. Or maybe it's just control, just wanting to be in control, and that's a huge one, right? Everything's great when we're in control, when we call in the shots, when things are going the way we want, but all of a sudden that control is stripped away, and then we find out that there was something I was really depending upon for my joy and my satisfaction, and it's been exposed. It's exposed now. And what I want to suggest this morning is that we're to live by faith, right? We know that. Hebrews 11:6, for without faith it is what? Impossible to please Him, but we must believe that He is, and I think everybody here this morning is here because you believe that He is. You believe there is a God, you believe who He is. You wouldn't be here if you didn't believe that this morning. But where we miss it is the second part. Do we really believe that He is a rewarder of those that diligently seek Him? Because we have settled for some of the things that the world gives us. We have settled for these things that sometimes we lift up as being key and very, very important in our lives, and we can't live without. We've settled for those things, and we've stopped diligently pursuing the one who can reward us with what's really important and what really satisfies and what really fulfills. And you can tell that by your life. You can tell that by how much time you are spending. I just read, I think last week, a quote by Francis Chan who said the most important thing you can do right now is just get alone with God, spend time with Him. It's the most important thing you can do. But are we individually and even as a group diligently seeking God? And do we really believe that what he will reward us with far surpasses any of these temporal things that we cling to so much? I confess that I believe in God, and I believe that he's going to take care of me, and I'm resting in the sovereignty of God. But am I diligently seeking the one who can reward me in vastly better ways than the things that I've kind of settled for? Right? So what's your idol? What's your idol this morning? Now, just a little review. Paul has made it very clear in the end of chapter 9 that we're in a race, and this race has a purpose. That means life has a purpose. And we're to run to win, which means we're to run to accomplish the purpose that God has designed for us. And Paul addresses that here. But he also says over and over again that this race is not easy. The Christian race is not easy. And we want to kind of pull it back in. We want to pull back the pace. We want to slow down the pace so that it's relatively easy. We don't want to run full out. We don't want to run the whole gamut of the race. We want to avoid that hill and avoid that hill if we can. And Paul says, no, we're running a race with a purpose, and that purpose means we have to go the way God calls us, and it may mean going up that hill, and it may mean it's going to be a struggle. It's not going to be easy. So then what happens is Satan wants us to be discouraged. And he's trying to discourage us. And he's trying to offer other alternatives that seem to be easier. Man, if you'd go this shortcut, it'd be a whole lot easier. And it seems like it is. And sometimes we've gone down those shortcuts only to find out that it really isn't easier in the long run. Right? So Paul says there's a race. It's not easy to be run. He wants us to be discouraged. He doesn't, but Satan wants us to be discouraged, so we won't run that race. And then he just gives us a few things about that. We looked in chapter 8, and remember what we learned in chapter 8? That this race that we're running, that Paul says we should strive to win, is a race in which we need to be willing to lay down our rights, our undeniable rights, in order to serve other people. That's a very hard one. And the only way you're going to do that in life is if you truly believe that God is a rewarder of those who diligently serve him, and that he will reward you as you diligently serve him and follow him and do what he calls you to do, right? Then we get to verse 9, and Paul spends chapter 9, Paul spends most of his time in chapter 9 demonstrating to what extent he is willing to go in giving up his rights so he doesn't hinder the gospel. And he stresses basically that if you want to be an Olympian, you have to train and you have to prepare and you have to endure like an Olympian. We all might think it'd be nice to be an Olympian, but that's about as far as we get for most of us. We don't want to put the 4 to 8 years of constant practice in, 40 hours a week, to attain one goal, and that's to win that race. But Paul's saying, by analogy here, that if you want to be a winning Christian, you have to be willing to do what it takes to be a winning Christian. We have to be willing to run the race, discipline ourselves, take it seriously, and keep the gospel at the forefront. Because it's the gospel that's really what's exciting. The gospel is how God can free and liberate people who are enslaved to their sin, which is ruining their lives. It frees people from wrong thinking. It frees them from thinking like the Gentiles so that they can think biblically, so they can understand the fact that God is the only one that can truly satisfy them. So it's about the gospel. Now, chapter 10, he shifts a little bit from our responsibility to others, being sensitive to them and going out of our way to help them, to your personal responsibility now to keep your life on track. Your personal responsibility to not use the grace that you have as a license. And it seems that the Corinthian believers were kind of taking for granted what they had in their salvation and saying, I want the best of both worlds. I love the fact that I'm saved and I have this relationship with Christ and I have these spiritual gifts that I'm being able to use. But since that's all true, then I can just keep delving in over here to some of the stuff the world has to offer and I have the best of both worlds. And Paul says, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. They were still holding on to some of their idols, is what it really boils down to. So in our chapter here, chapter 10, 1 Corinthians, Paul starts out by giving us some examples. And as he's looking at the Corinthian believers, he's saying to them, listen, this isn't the first time this has happened. You aren't the first group of people that have wandered off, that have got sucked into some of the world's thinking, who have placed other things before Christ. You're not the first group. You won't be the last. We're all in that same boat. In fact, apart from the grace of God, we're all failures. We're all messing up. And it would be very discouraging if it weren't for the gospel. But he goes back to the Old Testament, and he gives us some examples here that we can learn from. Verse 1, now I do not want you, to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And they all ate the same spiritual food, and they all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. So there was a very privileged group of people. They are our ancestors, in the sense that Abraham is the father of all those who have faith, right? As Gentiles. Not all Israelites are believers, people of faith. But this group of people, as a nation, though all were not saved, were all called. God called this nation a specific way. He blessed them all. They had the cloud by day, the fire by night to lead them. They passed through the Red Sea. They were all identified with Moses as their leader, baptized into Moses, the idea of being identified with him now as he's going to lead them as they went through this cloud under his leadership, through the sea with his leadership. Then God blessed them all to eat the same spiritual food, which would be manna, drink the same spiritual drink, which referring to probably the rock that was open for them when they were in need of water more than once. And then it says, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. In other words, even back then, the Messiah was with his people. He wasn't with them physically. He hadn't arrived yet as he had, or now in this context, but he was still with them, and he was taking care of them, and he was providing for them every step of the way. They had everything they needed. He was with them. Nothing wore out. I mean, you know the story. Then comes the sad part. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them since they were struck down in the wilderness. Now there's a gravity to this passage this morning. A gravity that I think sometimes we miss in our Christian lives. Because we live in an age of grace, God is long-suffering and very patient with us in so many ways. But he is also a holy and just God. And he also is a God who brings severe consequences into the lives of people who don't listen to him, who ignore him, who chase after idols rather than following after him. So he says, Israelites were there. They were given to sin. And they are now, it says in verse 6, examples for us. Why? So that we will not desire evil things as they did. So that we will not go chasing after things that Satan has somehow packaged up to make look good and righteous, thinking that somehow they will provide for me what I need, rather than chasing after God. Because this is what happened to the Israelites, and he just goes into 4 illustrations here of sin and the results of those sins. Just bam, bam, bam. He's just shooting these out. They're familiar with these stories. He's just reminding them what happened. Now listen, here's where you are today. I want to caution you. I don't want you to be unaware of what God has done in the past when people drifted away from trusting him and put their trust into idols and into things that they thought would somehow meet their needs and ended up in sin. And he gives us 4 different things that they did. Number 1 was idolatry. We see that in verse 7, don't become idolaters, as some were. As is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to party. All right, so what's the story? The story is when Moses was on the mountain for those 40 days and nights, and the people got discouraged without having a leader there, and they wanted something that they could see, something that they could bow down and worship like in the good old days back in Egypt. And so Aaron manufactures the golden calf. They gather around this golden calf, and they, quote unquote, worship the Lord via this idol. which is totally going against what God had commanded them in Exodus chapter 20. Thou shalt have no images, graven images before you, right? So they totally violate the command of Exodus 24. They revert back to their pagan tendencies that they had acquired when they were in Egypt, because they're looking for some other way to worship God than the way that God says that they should, and that's just to simply believe and put their faith in Him. They wanted something tangible. They wanted something they could hold on to. They wanted something they could see, because God wasn't enough. And they became idolaters. Now today we live in an age that's filled with non-physical idols. In other words, things that you treasure more than you treasure God. And again, the question is, what do I treasure more than I treasure God? And we can only evaluate that by looking and see, what do we spend the most time pursuing? What is it that's in the center of my thinking the most? What am I willing to sacrifice for? If we were to go to 2 Timothy 3, and I won't read the whole passage, but I'm just going to give you the ones that are associated with love. But Paul says in the end days, these are going to be hard times in the end days, which is where we are today. Because people are going to be, first of all, lovers of self. We can make ourselves the biggest idol. Another big one in America, obviously, is lovers of money. Then it says they don't love good. In other words, they love bad. You can even make bad an idol. Lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. All right? So those are just some general categories of how we make idols in our lives. Non-physical idols. But the truth is, we're always looking for a different way to worship God besides just trusting Him. We want something else that we can cling to, something else we can work on. It's built into our nature that I have to do something to earn favor with Him. I have to do something in order to find this fulfillment. I can't just trust Him and pursue Him, because He seems elusive. So we're always looking for a different way. If I find fulfillment, if I can just find fulfillment, if I can just become fulfilled, then I can better serve God. So instead of pursuing God, what do I pursue? I pursue self-fulfillment, thinking that if I can just get that, then I can do better in my worship of God. Or if I had more money, then I could just give more and serve God more that way. So I'm pursuing money rather than God. Or sometimes we think you just have to do a little bad in order to do good, so compromise here and there instead of trusting God that His way works when I do the right thing. Or I would love God more if I was enjoying more of life, the things God gave me to enjoy, so I'm just going to pursue all these pleasures in life. And then when I'm enjoying the pleasures of life, then that'll help me appreciate God more. Whatever it is, we get off track. We get off track by pursuing something other than God and thinking something other than God will fulfill us. And we are all guilty of that this morning. There's nobody sitting here that's not. We are all in some way pursuing something else in our life, thinking somehow at some level that that's going to fulfill us in a way that God's not. And it's keeping us from diligently pursuing Him. Because we don't really believe that He will, first of all, maybe reward us, or that if He will reward us, that those rewards are going to be more fulfilling and more satisfying, and I'll be more content with them than these other things that I already can somewhat feel and taste and touch. And Paul says here, in the life of Israel, they did that. They went and worshiped, they sat down to eat and drink, had a big party. And then Moses came down the mountain, as you know, and there was a plague that started there, and several of them were killed. Tragic results. We go on to the next one. Let us not commit sexual immorality. I see popping up in this book. It's so current. This book is so current to where we live today. Sexual immorality is rampant in our culture, and it is constant temptation for believers in maybe different forms, but it is a constant temptation in our culture. Sexual immorality. And the last word in verse 7, got up to party, has sexual innuendos, which probably led Paul to this next point, because as they were worshiping the idol and thought they were somehow worshiping God, they got in such a party mode, frenzy mode, that they ended up involving themselves in sexual immorality, and in a single day 23,000 people died. What's the point? They were idolaters, they were sexually immoral, and there was punishment. God didn't just let it go. Folks, God is jealous for us. God is jealous for his people. Now, the church is not Israel. And there's a lot of separation there, but we're not going to go into that today. But he was jealous for his people Israel as a nation. He was jealous for his people today as a church. Have you ever met a sex addict? It consumes that person. It's like any addiction. But it enslaves them. We had a lady who I would classify as a sex addict coming to our church. And we gave her the gospel several times. But she just could not break out of it, and her life was just a mess and unfulfilled. And the more she pursued that, the less fulfilled she was. Right? Because God won't let you prosper, and God won't give you fulfillment and contentment if you're defiling his law, if you're going against what he says is wrong or right. And then the next thing he says that Israel did is they were testing God. Numbers 21. We don't have time to go into all these. Numbers 21. God had provided them manna to eat, water to drink. But the people just weren't happy. They just weren't satisfied. Why did you bring us out of Egypt to die? All we have is this miserable manna. How often do we test God by, this is kind of similar to complaining, but the idea is they were detesting his provision. They were never happy. They were never content. They were testing God's patience. They kept pushing for more, just like the Corinthians were pushing their liberties to the limits, to indulge in the flesh, to see what they could get more of, because somehow there wasn't enough for them in what God was providing. At least they didn't think so. They were despising God. If you're not satisfied with what you have, and you just keep saying, God, I need more, then you're really detesting God. You're despising God. You're despising his provision. And it says they were destroyed by snakes. What a horrid thing to have a bunch of snakes just coming into your house, into your tent, getting bit, people dying all over the place. Why? Because they were despising God. Then the fourth one is complaining. And don't complain as some did and were killed by the destroyer. In the context, they were complaining against God's leadership, God's authority, complaining against Moses and Aaron, and then complaining against God. God, remember, opened the ground and swallowed up all those leaders and their families? And then the people of Israel gathered around Moses and Aaron and started complaining and saying it was their fault that these people had been killed, and they were complaining about God's clear justice and what God did. They didn't want to surrender to God's authority. They didn't want to be submissive, and so they were killed. 14,700 complainers in one day. So what's his point? All this is just saying, listen, I want to remind you now that you're getting off track here as believers, and you're starting to chase after these other things, and this is a repeated behavior, and this is what happened in the Old Testament. And when they did it in the Old Testament, there was severe punishment that came, severe consequences. Paul's saying, I don't want you to go there. I don't want you to have to encounter that. And then he gets to the key verse here, the key problem, which is verse 12. So whoever thinks he stands, be careful not to fall. Now, this whole problem of arrogance and pride has permeated this book. Chapter 4 was mentioned 3 times. Chapter 5 was mentioned again. Arrogance, pride, the idea that I'm okay. I don't really need to diligently seek after God because I got this handled. Everything's good in my life. You know, the water's running, the electric's on, my car didn't break down this week. Nobody's sick this week. I mean, everything's good. Why do I diligently need to seek after God? Be careful when you think you stand. because that's when you're going to fall. When you stop pursuing God, when you stop leaning on God, when you stop depending upon God, when you start thinking these other things are enough to fulfill you in life, and when you lower yourself to the level where you're just happy with that and you're not seeking God, be careful, because you're going to fall. Paul says, look at what happened in the Old Testament. God is the same today as he was then. And God certainly is not going to allow us to keep going down a path of being satisfied with the things of this world when we're his children. He is definitely going to intervene. He's definitely going to bring us back. Sometimes we live like practical atheists, right? We believe in God, but practically, the way we live doesn't exhibit it. And we try to overextend. You know, yesterday we were driving back through the neighborhood, and there was a crane in our neighborhood. You know, so envision this big truck with a boom sticking off the back. And when we came through, the boom was parallel to the ground and the truck was like this. Because he had overextended. He'd gone up over one house, the house that they were associated with, they were working on. It was just all, they had just enclosed it with the OSB. And he was trying to reach down in the backyard and pick up a whole pallet full of, or whatever you call it, full of OSB, I guess, to get it out or something like that. And somehow he had overextended, right? And so the whole thing went bam, came down through the house that it was reaching over, and the end of it went into the house next door that was finished, right through the roof, right? He overextended. He thought he was okay. He thought he could do it on his own. This baby crane had to call in two big cranes to get it back up and fixed. Because he you know, I know that cranes aren't proudful, but this crane was like, man, I can do this. I got this handled. No, he couldn't. And he fell flat on his face, and that's exactly what's going to happen to us when we think that we can do or acquire without God, without his strength, without his help. So he's telling us, listen, you're not okay, you're not an exception, there is no easier way. You must do it God's way, or you will, in fact, have issues. You will have problems. So then he inserts this verse, because right now we need something positive. Because Paul is just nailing the Corinthians and basically nailing us, saying, you're idol worshipers. You're chasing after things other than God. I am, I do, you do, we all do. There's terrible consequences that come from that. Some of the consequences that are in our lives right now is a result of chasing after things we thought would give us satisfaction and didn't. And God didn't let us keep going that direction, thankfully. Right? And so it's like, what's the use? How can I change this? I'm just an idol worshiper. I love my idols. I love all this stuff. What's the hope? Where is the hope? How can I break out of this? How can I ever become what I need to become? And Paul comes to verse 13, which is a very familiar verse, and says, listen, the warning is you're going to fall if you think you can do this on your own. But no temptation has come upon you except what is common to humanity. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation, he will also provide a way out so that you may be able to bear it. Familiar verse, let me just break it down real quick. This is good news. Here's the good news. We're all struggling. This morning, if we're honest, we all have more than one idol in our lives. Something we're clinging to, something that we really have to have, something we would really struggle to give up because we are just kind of clinging to it. But Paul says, listen, there's nothing in your life that's a temptation that's not common to man. Meaning that there's nothing in your life that you will face and you're not exempt from. You're not the only one facing it, and you're not the first one facing it, because these are common temptations. It's a common temptation to put your trust in money. It's a common temptation to put your trust in, you name it, whatever it is that you're tempted to do, because we all have different temptations. We're not all tempted by the same stuff, but they're common, so that's good news. They're common. In other words, I'm not the first person, I'm the last person. If I go to Hebrews chapter 11, I see that many people work through these things by faith. It can happen again, and then it comes to the very best part about this, and that is God is faithful. He's trustworthy every time. You can believe in him always. He'll never sleep or slumber. You can trust him in all his ways. In fact, the greatest joy you can ever experience will be found in trusting him and not playing the edge and trying to find what you need from the world. There's only one God, and anything else that tries to replace him is really a deception from hell. So what do we need to do? We need to identify our idols, repent of our idols, forsake our idols, and put a complete and wholehearted trust in God. That's the goal. That's the general goal. Now his promise is this: no temptation beyond your ability. You say, well, I got lots of temptations beyond my ability. And that's true, you do. And that does not mean there is no temptation beyond your ability if you exclusively are trying to conquer it yourself. You cannot separate that from the following phrase, but God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but will with the temptation also provide a way out. So the reason you are able to bear up under the temptation and not give in to trusting something else other than God is because God will give you what you need. He will provide a way out. He will help you through it. He will generate within you, as you trust him, a strength that you didn't know. And where you were addicted to whatever, the more God becomes dominant in your life, the more his power comes and enables you to overcome that addiction. And before you know it, that addiction is not what it used to be. Doesn't mean it goes away, but it's not going to control you. That's the promise. You don't have to be killed. You don't have to suffer. You don't have to go through many of those severe consequences that you see people going through if you'll trust in him. If you trust in him. You'll be able to bear it, he says. That doesn't mean he takes it away. Now what we want is relief. God, there's a temptation here. Please take it away. I don't want to have to endure it. I don't want to have to go through it. I don't have to trust you in the midst of this. And God says, no, there's no temptation that you can't get through with my help, but you have to go through it. And God gets more glory when you go through it, and as a result of his strength in your life, have victory, than if he were to just take it away and you never learn to trust him. Because we don't learn to trust God and live by faith and learn how good he is and learn how fulfilling and satisfying he is unless we go through those struggles, unless we're tempted, unless that idol is looming there and it's looking very, very provocative and we want it, but yet we turn back to God and we say, God, I can't do this without you. I need you, and he provides a way and helps us. And we get through that and we go, oh, this is so much better. I'm so glad I didn't go in that direction. In fact, I've been there before. I know how self-defeating it is, and I don't want that. I want God. And you get that victory and it just spurs you on to want another victory. Right? Because it's just so good to be able to trust God and allow him to get you through. Then he goes back to a final thought here, and I got to just go through it quickly. He just makes the clear command, flee adultery. So listen, dear friends, flee adultery. Flee anything that you are tempted to put before the Lord. Flee anything that is got a hold of you and is somehow controlling you. Flee it. Run from it. Don't stay there in that proximity and allow it to continue to control you. I'm speaking to sensible people. Judge yourselves what I'm saying. And then he spends a little bit of time here talking about our deep relationship with Christ. Our deep relationship with Christ. And that's where we're going to end today as we go to the Lord's Supper. He says, judge for yourselves what I'm saying. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a sharing in the blood of Christ? And the bread we break, is it not a sharing in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, and we who are many are one body, since all of us share the one bread. He's talking about a special relationship we have with Jesus, right? Somehow we're sharing in his death. And we're sharing in his resurrection, in his life. The blood represents his death, the bread represents his life. And the truth is, Jesus is the only real source of life that there is. And as we together feed on him, i.e. turn from our idols and then put our focus in pursuing him together, diligently pursuing him, he rewards us. And we receive life because He is the source. He's the source. We're sharing it. We have been called into this special relationship. It says in 1 Corinthians 1:9, God is faithful. You were called by Him into fellowship with His Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. We've been called into a special relationship with Jesus. We're sharing in His death, His resurrection, so that now we have been freed from the enslavement that is controlling the world. That we don't have to be under that anymore. We don't have to sin. We don't have to fall prone to that because we're sharing in Jesus. This word sharing is the idea of participating, and we're participating here. We've been called into a special relationship. We're participating in the benefits that come from His death and life. And when we gather around the table this morning, we share in the Lord's Supper. It's not the symbols themselves that create the unity among us, but it's the Spirit of God working in our hearts and drawing us together that makes the difference. It's the meal that we take affirming, but it's the Holy Spirit connecting. He goes back to the Old Testament, verse 18, and says, when the people ate the food sacrificed on the altar, they were participating in the altar. In other words, it was all part of one. In other words, they sacrificed on the altar to God in worship, and as a result of that, there was food left over. They wouldn't partake of that. It was all part of their worship of God. And so when you are partaking or sharing in these sacrifices, going back to the context, it's all about sharing in and being part of these sacrifices that were taking place to true idols, or real live idols there in the Corinthian church. He says, when you go in and you participate in that, you go into their temples and you're involved in these feasts, you're actually participating in this whole worship. Even though you may not be worshiping that idol, you're participating in the whole feast and the whole process that is all bound to that idol. And he comes to verse 20 and says, no, but I do say that what they sacrifice to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot share in the Lord's table and the table of demons. And so he brings it down to why this is so serious. He says, when we get caught up with any kind of idol worship, which sounds foreign to us, but when we place anything ahead of Christ, when we desire anything more than Christ, and it becomes an idol, behind that is a satanic influence, a satanic power. And Satan arrives or sends his minions into any situation where we are diverted from complete devotion to the Lord and start devoting ourselves and separating ourselves unto something else. When we enter into any kind of league or participating in with or sharing in with something apart from worshiping the Lord, we're associated with demon worship. He says that's the real problem, and what we are doing is provoking the Lord to jealousy because we're His. And the question is, are we stronger than He? In other words, if you do this, how can you possibly get away with it? You can't. It's going to bankrupt your spiritual life. When you get married, you're devoting yourself to one person, right? In the church, the husband and wife is the picture of the church in Christ. We know that from Ephesians, right? So, when you marry your wife, and then you still want to go out and hang out with other women, that's a good way to blow up your marriage, right? Doesn't work. Doesn't work. Why? Because you have pledged yourself to one. You've been bought with a price in the sense of Christ buying us. We are His. We are 100% sharing in what He has done for us. He is our life. And what the Corinthians were doing are saying, yes, I love that Christ has given to me, but I want to go out and I want to hang out with somebody else for a while. Because I can. And Paul says, no, you can't. You can't do both. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. And Satan's so subtle, and he's so good at deceiving us into thinking that we're okay while we're trusting in things other than God, while we're diligent in seeking after other things rather than God, and while our lives are consumed with so many things rather than God. And if the world looks at our lives today, will they see that we are actively pursuing God? That's the question. Will they see that we are sharing in and participating in what Christ has done in our lives and we're excited about it and it's the main part of our lives? Or will they think, oh, that person is pursuing money and that person is pursuing control and that person is pursuing whatever it is? Or are we provoking the Lord to jealousy? Why would we want to make God jealous? Because He will not stand for it. He will not let us keep going our own way and indulging in the things of this world without consequences. It's going to happen because He loves us, and Hebrews tells us He disciplines those who are His. And if you're not getting disciplined, you're an illegitimate child. So you will get disciplined. And Paul's warning them, don't go there. Don't go there. It's a very, very dangerous place to go. He's jealous. God is jealous over us. We can't come this morning and drink and eat of these symbols, which represent the greatest wonder in creation, in the world, and then go home and drink the cup of the devil all week. We can't do it. Not and get away with it. Can't do it and get away with it. We can do it. We can't do it and get away with it. As Paul says, we have a personal responsibility to diligently seek after God. So what or who are you elevating above Jesus this morning? What do you sacrifice for? It can be something as good as your family, folks. If your family comes before Jesus, they're your idol. Now, there's a delicate balance there, but Jesus has to be the prominent one all the time. All the time. So where are we at? The truth is we're failures. We're failures. You know, it just amazes me how often I find myself chasing the wrong things. How often I am caught up with and enamored with things that are so piddly compared to Jesus. And that's why Paul was so excited about the gospel. Because it's the gospel that frees us from this stuff. I don't want to say what I was thinking. Wasn't really good. It's the gospel that frees us. So we sit here this morning and feel like we are trash. We can't do it right. We got all these stupid idols and we can't get over our idols. And some of you are sitting this morning thinking, I don't even care if I got an idol. Who cares? I like my idol. Leave me alone. Let me have my idol. You know what? The gospel is the answer to all that. And even when you have that attitude this morning, Jesus' blood still covers you. And you are still, in God's eyes, flawless. Isn't that amazing? That's where we have to come to. So many messages are discouraging because Paul's like, bam, bam, bam. You just got to get over this, and you got to do this, and you got to do this. But the truth is, he's doing that all the backdrop of the gospel. And he understands that these Corinthians were saved people. And in spite of all this, they were on their way to heaven. And in spite of all this, they're experiencing the love of God, and nothing can separate it from them, right? And he's just trying to keep them from enduring some stuff and some consequences that they don't need to endure in this life. They're still going to heaven, and so aren't we. But let's get all of God that we can now. Let's not mess around and wait till later. Let's not go through stuff in this life that we don't have to go through. If we'll just simply live by faith and believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. Diligently, aggressively, intensely, zealously. That's all God wants. He just wants our heart. He just wants us to chase Him. Chase Him. And that's all Paul's saying. Man, don't get off on the wrong track here. You're saved. You're saved people. You got every opportunity available to you. Take advantage of it. Follow him.